Picture this, it's February 19th, 1945. Aboard the USS Eldorado, Marine General Holland Smith stares at casualty reports from Iwo Jima that make his blood run cold. After witnessing the carnage on the beaches and the slow, grinding progress of his Marines, he turns to a group of war correspondents and says something remarkable. "I don't know who he is, but the Japanese general running this show is one smart bastard." Think about that for a moment. In the middle of one of the bloodiest battles in Marine Corps history, an American commander is openly praising his enemy. But here's what's even more fascinating. On the other side of that volcanic hellscape, the Japanese general he was talking about, Tadamichi Kuribayashi, had spent years studying in America, befriending American officers, and learning to both respect and fear the very Marines he would face in battle. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the Pacific War, Japanese commanders held surprisingly complex, sometimes contradictory views about the U.S. Marines. Some called them demons. Others recognized them as formidable warriors worthy of respect. A few actually understood American culture better than most Americans. Today, we're going to dive deep into the minds of Japanese commanders and discover what they really thought about the Marines who fought them across thousands of miles of Pacific islands. I'm going to share stories you've probably never heard before, letters written by Japanese generals to their families, tactical assessments found in captured documents, and revealing moments that show how the enemy viewed the legendary fighting force they faced. Because understanding your enemy isn't just about tactics, it's about understanding the human beings behind the battles that shaped history. So buckle up. This is going to be a journey through fear, respect, cultural clash, and the brutal reality of war as seen through Japanese eyes. The victory disease. Let's start at the beginning, and the beginning was a disaster for the Marines, but a string of victories for Japan. When the war erupted with Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese forces swept across the Pacific like a tidal wave. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, these weren't just defeats for America. They were absolute routs. And in those early months of 1942, Japanese commanders developed what historians now call victory disease, a dangerous overconfidence born from seemingly endless success. Consider what happened at Guadalcanal in August 1942. When Marines landed on that steaming jungle island, Japanese intelligence wasn't just wrong about American strength, they were catastrophically wrong. Intelligence reports estimated that maybe a few thousand troops had landed. The reality? Over 11,000 Marines hit those beaches on day one, with thousands more to follow. Colonel Kyoano Ichiki embodied this fatal overconfidence. When he was ordered to attack the Marine positions on Guadalcanal, he believed he was conducting a reconnaissance in force against a numerically inferior opponent. Japanese officers had told him the Marines were disorganized, poorly supplied, and ripe for the taking. Ichiki commanded just 600 men, but in his mind, that would be more than enough. On the night of August 21, 1942, Ichiki launched his attack across the Tenara River. What happened next would shake the Japanese command structure to its core. The Marines, far from being weak or disorganized, had prepared defensive positions with interlocking fields of fire. Machine guns, artillery, and disciplined rifle fire cut down the Japanese attackers in waves. By dawn, Ichiki's force was virtually annihilated. Somewhere around 800 Japanese soldiers lay dead. Ichiki himself, facing the shame of total defeat, committed suicide on the battlefield. The intelligence failure. But here's what's crucial to understand. This wasn't stupidity on the part of Japanese commanders. It was a systematic failure that revealed deep flaws in how the Imperial Japanese Army valued intelligence. Japanese military culture had a peculiar blind spot. Line officers and operations staff, the men who planned and executed battles, were openly contemptuous of intelligence officers. Intelligence work was seen as less honorable than frontline combat. This meant that commanders often made decisions based on wishful thinking, exaggerated reports of Japanese successes, or simply outdated information. After the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, Japanese naval intelligence claimed they'd sunk more American carriers than actually existed in the entire Pacific Fleet. These wildly optimistic reports filtered up to commanders making life-and-death decisions about troop deployments. When Admiral Yamamoto himself, arguably Japan's most brilliant naval mind, tried to warn about the seriousness of the Guadalcanal situation, comparing it to Port Arthur in the Russo-Japanese War, his concerns were dismissed by Army officers who believed the Americans could be easily pushed back into the sea. The intelligence failure extended beyond just numbers. Japanese commanders consistently underestimated not just the quantity of American forces, but their quality. Reports dismissed Marines as untested, soft, products of a decadent democracy who couldn't possibly match the warrior spirit of Japanese soldiers steeped in Bushido, the way of the samurai. One captured Japanese document from late 1942 reveals the mindset. A pamphlet distributed to soldiers described Americans as having no thought of the glory of their ancestors, their posterity, or their family name. It claimed they were daredevils in search of publicity, who feared death, and were easily taken in by flattery and propaganda. The document concluded that because Americans were materialistic, they relied on material superiority rather than spiritual incentive in battle. The awakening. But reality has a way of shattering illusions, and Japanese commanders were about to get a brutal education in what U.S. Marines could actually do. After the disaster at the Tenaru, Japanese commanders sent another force, this time 6,000 men under Major General Kyoto Kawaguchi. Surely, they thought, a properly sized force would overwhelm the Marines. From September 12 to 14, 1942, Kawaguchi's troops attacked Marine positions along what would become known as Edson's Ridge, named after Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, who led the defense. For 3 nights, Japanese forces hurled themselves at the Marine lines. They came in waves, screaming, firing, dying by the hundreds in the darkness. Marine artillery turned the jungle into an inferno. Machine guns created killing fields that Japanese troops had to cross again and again. When dawn broke on September 14th, Kawaguchi's force had been shattered. The ridge, now also called Bloody Ridge, was littered with Japanese dead. These defeats forced a profound shift in Japanese thinking. Commanders began circulating tactical reports that painted a very different picture of the Marines. One report noted that American forces showed unexpected tenacity and sophisticated defensive preparations. Another observed that Marines demonstrated high morale despite supply shortages, and employed combined arms tactics effectively. But perhaps most tellingly, Japanese soldiers captured after these early battles told interrogators something that would be repeated throughout the war: the Marines fought differently than they expected. There was no panic, no collapse of morale, no quick victory. Instead, Marines displayed what the Japanese called unusual composure under fire, and a systematic approach to combat that suggested extensive training. The victory disease was beginning to wear off, replaced by something the Japanese military establishment found deeply troubling: respect mixed with fear. Because if the Marines could inflict such losses on Guadalcanal, what would happen when the war came closer to Japan's homeland? An unlikely enemy. Now we need to talk about arguably the most fascinating Japanese commander of the entire Pacific War, a man who represents the complicated relationship between Japanese officers and American culture. His name was Tadamichi Kuribayashi, and his story is absolutely remarkable. Born in 1891, Kuribayashi rose through the ranks of the Imperial Japanese Army as a cavalry officer. But what set him apart from his peers was his assignment from 1928 to 1930 as a military attaché to the United States. For 2 years, this Japanese officer lived, traveled, and studied throughout America, from Washington, D.C. to Boston, from Fort Bliss in Texas to Fort Riley in Kansas. He visited New York City, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. He even purchased a Chevrolet and learned to drive from American officers, using the car to journey across the country. But Kuribayashi didn't just tour America, he absorbed it. He wrote hundreds of letters back to Japan, many of them illustrated letters to his young son Taro, who couldn't yet read. These weren't military reports. They were observations of American life, American technology, American culture. He sketched pictures of skyscrapers, automobiles, factories, and everyday American scenes. Through these letters, we get a window into how this Japanese officer saw the country he would one day fight against. And here's what's crucial: Kuribayashi came to deeply respect, even admire, certain aspects of American society. During his time at Fort Riley, he befriended Brigadier General George Van Horn Moseley. He was entertained by Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks at their homes. He witnessed firsthand the staggering industrial capacity of American factories, particularly the automotive plants in Detroit, where he saw how a single button push could mobilize entire industries for military production. The warning nobody heeded. When Kuribayashi returned to Japan, he carried with him a conviction that would put him at odds with many of his fellow officers: Japan should never go to war with the United States. In discussions with other commanders, Kuribayashi was remarkably blunt. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the United States was the last country in the world Japan should fight. He had seen America's industrial might, its vast resources, its interconnected military and civilian production. He understood something that many Japanese militarists didn't: America's material advantage wasn't a weakness, it was an overwhelming strength. But more than that, Kuribayashi had observed something about American character that troubled him. Despite the propaganda that painted Americans as soft and decadent, Kuribayashi had met American soldiers and officers. He found them professional, innovative, and far from the pleasure-seeking weaklings Japanese propaganda portrayed. In his letters, he described Americans as rich, gregarious, and self-reliant people, not easy opponents at all. Some historians believe that Kuribayashi's frank assessments and his opposition to war with America actually worked against him. When he was assigned to command the defense of Iwo Jima in June 1944, some suspected it was a way for the high command to sideline an officer whose views were seen as defeatist or too sympathetic to the enemy. But if they thought they were sending Kuribayashi to a backwater where he couldn't cause trouble, they were dead wrong. Iwo Jima, tactical genius meets Marine Corps. Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island just 8 square miles in size, was strategically vital. It sat roughly halfway between the Mariana Islands, where American B-29 bombers were based, and the Japanese mainland. If America controlled Iwo Jima, damaged bombers could make emergency landings there, and fighter escorts could accompany the B-29s all the way to Japan. Kuribayashi arrived on the island and immediately began transforming it into something unprecedented. He knew he couldn't win. He'd seen enough of American power to understand that. But what he could do was make the Americans pay such a horrific price for Iwo Jima that it might slow their advance, might give Japan time to negotiate a better surrender, might at least let him defend with honor. But here's where Kuribayashi's tactical genius, and his understanding of American capabilities, comes into play. He did something that shocked both his own officers and eventually the Americans. He abandoned traditional Japanese defensive tactics entirely. For years, Japanese forces had relied on beach defenses, building fortifications right at the water's edge to massacre invading forces before they could establish a foothold. And once those beach defenses were breached, Japanese commanders typically ordered banzai charges, suicide attacks where soldiers would rush American positions screaming, "Banzai!" which means 10,000 years. A salute to the emperor. Kuribayashi looked at this strategy and recognized it for what it was: a way to die quickly with minimal damage to the enemy. He had studied American amphibious tactics. He knew the Marines had developed sophisticated techniques: naval bombardment, air support, tanks, flamethrowers, and most importantly, the ability to bring overwhelming firepower to bear on any position. So Kuribayashi issued orders that would have been considered heretical by traditional Japanese military thinking. First, no troops stationed on the beaches. When the Marines landed, they would face minimal resistance and might think the bombardment had done its job. Second, build an elaborate network of tunnels, not just trenches or foxholes, but actual underground fortifications connecting defensive positions across the entire island. Some of these tunnels went 75 feet underground, safe from American bombardment. Third, and most controversially, no banzai charges under any circumstances. Any officer who ordered a banzai charge would be severely punished. His logic was simple but devastating: let the Marines land. Let them move inland. Then, from concealed positions in the volcanic rock, open fire. When American forces overrun a position, have soldiers retreat through tunnels to new positions behind the Americans. Force them to fight for every yard. Make them dig you out of caves, bunkers, and reinforced positions one by one. Maximize American casualties, maximize the time it takes to capture the island, and whatever happens, make sure that when Japan finally loses Iwo Jima, America will remember what it cost. Facing the Marines. On February 19, 1945, the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches of Iwo Jima. The pre-invasion bombardment had been intense, 9 months of naval shelling and air raids. American commanders thought surely most Japanese defenders were dead or incapacitated. The Marines landed on volcanic ash beaches, black sand so fine that vehicles bogged down immediately. And for the first hour, resistance was surprisingly light. Marines began to think this would be the 5-day operation their commanders had predicted. Then Kuribayashi sprang his trap. From concealed positions on the high ground, especially Mount Suribachi, the dormant volcano dominating the southern tip of the island, Japanese artillery, mortars, and machine guns opened up. Marines on the beach were caught in a killing field. Landing craft bringing reinforcements were hit before they could unload. The black volcanic sand ran red with blood. General Holland Smith, watching from the command ship, was stunned. The casualty reports were unlike anything he'd seen before. And as days turned to weeks, as Marines fought yard by yard through the most hellish terrain imaginable, Smith came to realize what Kuribayashi had done. Every cave had to be cleared with flamethrowers or explosives. Every tunnel system had to be methodically destroyed. Marines would take a position only to receive fire from positions they passed earlier because Japanese soldiers had used tunnels to relocate. American forces adapted, they developed corkscrew and blowtorch tactics, using explosives and flamethrowers systematically. But adaptation wasn't enough to prevent the casualties from mounting. On February 23, 1945, a Marine patrol reached the summit of Mount Suribachi and raised the American flag, the famous photograph by Joe Rosenthal that would become one of the most iconic images of World War II. But that flag raising, just 4 days into the battle, represented only the southern tip of the island. 5 more weeks of brutal combat lay ahead. Letters from the dark. As the battle ground on, Kuribayashi continued writing letters to his wife and family. These weren't propaganda. They were private correspondence found after the battle. In them, we see a commander who knew exactly what fate awaited him but remained focused on his duty. In one letter written in January 1945, he told his wife that his death was a certainty and urged her to leave Tokyo before American firebombing destroyed the city. He wrote, "I am sorry to end my life here, fighting the United States of America. But I want to defend this island as long as possible and to delay the enemy air raids on Tokyo." Another letter to his daughter Takako, his beloved Teiko-chan, written just before the battle, shows the human side of this commander. "In my mind's eye, I can still see you and Mother standing by the gate to see me off on the day I left. Since then, I've dreamed several times of going back home and taking a walk around the neighborhood with you and Mother. Sadly, though, it's something I can't really do." By mid-March, Kuribayashi's forces had been reduced to a few hundred men trapped in the northern part of the island. On March 16, he sent his final radio message to Tokyo, then ordered the regimental colors burned. His last words in that message included a death poem. "Arrows and bullets all spent, so sad we fall." The Japanese government actually censored that poem. They changed sad to mortified. They couldn't allow a general's sorrow over the deaths of his men to be made public. The official story had to be about shame at defeat, not grief for lives lost. The final stand. On the night of March 26, 1945, Kuribayashi removed his rank insignia and personally led about 300 remaining Japanese soldiers in a final attack on American positions near the northern airfields. It was not a banzai charge in the traditional sense. There was no screaming, no waves of attackers. Instead, it was a silent, methodical assault in the darkness, aimed at enemy headquarters and artillery positions. The attack inflicted casualties on American forces, but it was ultimately futile. Somewhere in that final battle, Kuribayashi died. His body was never found or identified. Some accounts say he was killed leading the attack. Others suggest he committed ritual suicide shortly after. His grave remains unknown to this day. When Marine General Holland Smith learned about Kuribayashi's tactics and leadership after the battle, he made a statement that speaks volumes. Of all our adversaries in the Pacific, Kuribayashi was the most redoubtable. Think about that coming from a Marine Corps general. Most redoubtable, most formidable, most to be feared and respected. Smith had faced Japanese commanders across the Pacific, and this was the one he singled out. The battle cost the Marines dearly. More than 6,800 Marines were killed and nearly 20,000 wounded out of approximately 70,000 who fought on the island. The Marines expected to capture Iwo Jima in 5 days. Kuribayashi and his men held out for 36 days. It remains one of the costliest battles in Marine Corps history. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of Kuribayashi's thinking about the Marines comes from before the battle even began. When planning his defenses, he specifically studied Marine tactics from previous island battles. He analyzed how they used combined arms, how they adapted to Japanese tactics, how they brought overwhelming firepower to bear. He prepared for the Marines specifically because he knew, from his time in America and from reports of earlier battles, that he faced a professional, well-trained, highly motivated force. Kuribayashi never underestimated the Marines. In that respect, that understanding of his enemy's capabilities made him the deadliest opponent the Marines faced in the entire Pacific War. The propaganda machine. Now we need to talk about something darker. The campaign of fear that Japanese commanders deliberately cultivated among their own troops about American Marines. Because what commanders knew tactically and what they told their soldiers were often very different things. Japanese military propaganda painted Americans in general, and Marines specifically, as something less than human. The Imperial Japanese government controlled virtually every form of media, newspapers, radio, films, books, magazines. They created a tightly integrated propaganda system that combined military information, domestic publishing, and complete control over what soldiers and civilians were told about the enemy. Soldiers were given pamphlets and heard lectures that described Americans as devils, as beasts, as creatures devoid of honor or humanity. The Marines, being the tip of the American spear in the Pacific, received special attention in this propaganda. They were portrayed as brutal savages who would torture and execute prisoners, as men without the code of Bushido who fought only for material gain. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Japanese commanders knew that surrender was unthinkable in their culture, but they reinforced this taboo with deliberate lies designed to ensure soldiers would fight to the death rather than be captured. They will eat you. Multiple sources from interrogations of Japanese prisoners after the war revealed a shocking common thread. Japanese soldiers were terrified of being captured by Marines because their officers had told them they would be eaten. Yes, you read that correctly. Cannibalism. Japanese officers told their troops that if they surrendered to the Americans, particularly the Marines, they would be tortured, mutilated, and then eaten. Some versions of this propaganda claimed Americans were cannibals as a matter of cultural practice. Other versions suggested that Marines specifically ate Japanese soldiers as an intimidation tactic, or out of racial hatred. This wasn't just word of mouth or rumor. It was official military indoctrination. Officers repeated these claims in briefings. It appeared in training materials. And because Japanese soldiers had been raised in a culture that emphasized absolute obedience to authority and absolute faith in their officers, many believed it. Now, where did this propaganda come from? Historians have identified several sources. First, there was deliberate distortion of real incidents. Some American troops in the Pacific did take trophies from dead Japanese soldiers, gold teeth, ears, skulls. These actions were not official policy and were actually condemned by American commanders, but they were photographed by war correspondents and appeared in magazines like Life. Japanese propagandists seized on these images as proof of American barbarity. Second, there was a calculated exploitation of cultural differences. The Japanese concept of honor demanded that a warrior die in battle rather than accept the shame of capture. But explaining this to soldiers exhausted, starving, and facing overwhelming odds was difficult. By making capture seem not just shameful but literally fatal in the most horrific way possible, commanders ensured soldiers would fight until killed. Third, and perhaps most cynically, was the recognition that keeping soldiers in the dark about American treatment of prisoners served strategic purposes. If word got out that Americans actually treated prisoners decently, gave them food, medical care, and respected basic human dignity, then more soldiers might choose survival over death. The entire military system depended on soldiers' willingness to die rather than retreat or surrender. The reality versus the myth. Here's what's tragically ironic about all this. American forces, including the Marines, generally did treat Japanese prisoners according to the Geneva Conventions once they were captured. Prisoners received medical treatment, food, and were not executed or tortured as policy. Were there war crimes committed by individual American soldiers? Yes, absolutely. War brings out the worst in people, and the Pacific War was characterized by brutal racial hatred on both sides. There were incidents of Americans killing Japanese soldiers attempting to surrender, of mistreating bodies, of revenge killings. But these were not official policy, and were actually punished when discovered by American commanders. Ernie Pyle, the famous war correspondent who covered the Pacific Theater after spending years in Europe, wrote something revealing after visiting Saipan in 1944. He interviewed Marines who had fought the Japanese and noted, "Soldiers and Marines have told me stories by the dozen about how tough the Japs are, yet how dumb they are, how illogical and yet how uncannily smart at times, how easy to rout when disorganized, yet how brave." But most importantly, Pyle observed that Marines on the front lines didn't see the Japanese the way propaganda portrayed on either side. He wrote that the men who actually fought them said they were dangerous fighters, who have weapons and fire them like good, tough soldiers. The Marines, having faced the Japanese in combat, recognized them as human enemies, fearsome, but human. The Bushido trap. Japanese commanders faced a fundamental contradiction. They needed to motivate their troops to fight against overwhelming odds, but the traditional samurai code of Bushido, which emphasized honor, loyalty, and death before dishonor, was actually counterproductive in modern warfare. Bushido, in its pure form, prepared warriors for individual combat or battles between relatively equal forces. It emphasized courage, self-sacrifice, and maintaining honor. But World War II wasn't about individual warrior prowess. It was about industrial production, logistics, combined arms tactics, and the ability to replace losses. So Japanese commanders adapted Bushido for propaganda purposes. They emphasized the parts about dying with honor while conveniently downplaying the parts about wisdom and protecting one's men. They created what historians call military Bushido, a version of the warrior code specifically designed for modern mass warfare and total mobilization. This military Bushido told soldiers that surrender was the ultimate shame, that dying for the emperor literally transformed you into a deity, that spiritual strength could overcome material weakness, and that Americans, being materialistic and soft, could never match the warrior spirit of Japanese soldiers. But notice what this does. It sets up a scenario where Japanese troops are psychologically prepared only for victory or death, with no middle ground. Retreat is shameful. Surrender is unthinkable. Even tactical withdrawal is seen as failure. This mindset, reinforced by propaganda about American brutality, meant Japanese forces often fought in situations where any rational military assessment would call for retreat or surrender to preserve forces for future battles. Commanders' private doubts. Here's what makes this even more complex. Many Japanese commanders privately doubted the propaganda they were feeding their troops. Admiral Yamamoto famously warned that war with America would be disastrous. He had studied at Harvard and served as naval attaché in Washington. He knew America's industrial capacity. After Pearl Harbor, he allegedly said he feared Japan had awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with a terrible resolve. Whether he actually used those exact words is debated, but the sentiment matches his private correspondence. Similarly, Kuribayashi's letters reveal a man who admired American innovation and feared American power, even as he prepared to fight to the death against American Marines. Even commanders who pushed the propaganda hardest sometimes revealed doubts in their private communications. A Japanese officer's diary captured after the Battle of Saipan contained this entry. The Americans fight with such coordination, infantry, tanks, artillery, and air support working as one. Our Bushido spirit cannot overcome machine guns and flamethrowers. But publicly, these same commanders had to maintain the fiction that Japanese forces could win through superior spirit and warrior ethos. Admitting doubt would be seen as defeatist and could result in reassignment, or worse. The tragic results. This propaganda and the fear it generated had tragic consequences that went beyond the battlefield. When American forces captured Saipan in July 1944, Japanese soldiers and civilians had been told that the Americans would torture, rape, and murder everyone. So when the battle was clearly lost, hundreds of Japanese civilians committed suicide, jumping off cliffs, detonating grenades, drowning themselves, rather than face capture. Marines watched in horror as mothers threw their children off cliffs before jumping themselves. American forces tried to stop it. They used loudspeakers to announce that civilians would not be harmed. They sent Japanese-speaking Americans to try to convince people to surrender peacefully. But the propaganda had done its work too well. The civilians were more terrified of the Americans than of death. This pattern repeated at Okinawa and other battles. The propaganda designed to make soldiers fight to the death also convinced civilians that capture meant a fate worse than death. Japanese commanders, through their propaganda and fear-mongering, had created a situation where their own people would rather die than surrender to an enemy who, while certainly no angels, did not actually pose the existential threat they'd been warned about. And for the Marines who witnessed these mass civilian deaths, it was a disturbing reminder that they weren't just fighting Japanese soldiers. They were fighting an ideology and a propaganda system that had convinced an entire population that Americans were monsters. The learning curve. One of the most fascinating aspects of the Pacific War is how Japanese commanders' opinions of U.S. Marines evolved as they learned from battlefield experience. It wasn't a simple progression from contempt to respect, it was more complicated than that. After the disasters at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and other early battles, Japanese commanders began circulating detailed after-action reports that showed a marked shift in tone. These weren't just casualty figures. They were tactical analyses that reveal how Japanese officers were beginning to understand what made the Marines so effective. A captured Japanese tactical manual from mid-1943 contains sections specifically about fighting American Marine forces. It's remarkably frank about Marine capabilities. Enemy forces demonstrate superior coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. Their defensive positions are prepared with sophistication and show evidence of extensive training. Enemy morale remains high even under heavy bombardment, or when suffering casualties. The manual goes on to note that Marines adapt quickly to Japanese tactics and show particular effectiveness in small unit operations where squad leaders can act independently. Compare this to the earlier assessments that dismissed Americans as soft and dependent on material superiority. Japanese commanders were learning that the Marines' material advantage wasn't just about having more equipment, it was about how they used that equipment. Combined arms mastery. What really impressed Japanese commanders, and frustrated their tactical planning, was the Marines' mastery of combined arms warfare. Traditional Japanese infantry tactics emphasized aggressive spirit and night attacks. The idea was that Japanese troops, motivated by Bushido and superior in close combat, could overwhelm American positions through courage and surprise. But the Marines had developed a defensive system that made such attacks suicidal. Here's how it worked. When Japanese forces attacked Marine positions, they weren't just facing riflemen in foxholes. They were facing a coordinated defensive network where each element supported the others. Machine guns were positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. If you survived running through one killing zone, you entered another. Artillery was pre-registered on likely approach routes, meaning American gunners already knew exactly where to aim. They could call down devastating barrages within minutes. Mortars provided closer support, dropping high-explosive rounds directly into Japanese assembly areas. And if an attack managed to break through the initial defensive line, there were reserve units ready to counterattack, often supported by tanks. A Japanese report from after the Battle of Saipan in 1944 noted with frustration, "American defensive positions function as an integrated system. Destroying one element does not create a breach. Their reserves fill gaps quickly, and their communication allows rapid coordination." Japanese commanders also noted how Marines used terrain. At Guadalcanal, Marines built their defensive perimeter around Henderson Field using natural features, rivers, ridges, swamps, to channelize Japanese attacks into prepared killing zones. At Tarawa, even on a tiny coral atoll with limited terrain features, Marines quickly established defensive positions using whatever material they had. Night fighting evolution. One area where Japanese commanders initially had confidence was in night operations. Japanese forces had trained extensively for night combat and had experienced considerable success in night battles against Chinese and early American opponents. But the Marines adapted, and Japanese commanders had to adjust their tactics accordingly. At Guadalcanal, the Marines expected night attacks. That was standard Japanese doctrine. So they prepared accordingly. They set up trip wires connected to flares, illuminating no man's land when disturbed. They organized interlocking machine gun fields that could be activated even in darkness. They developed a system where everyone stayed in their positions at night. Anyone moving between positions was assumed to be Japanese and shot. But here's where it gets interesting. The Marines also learned to attack at night when it suited them. General Merritt Edson, commanding forces on Guadalcanal, recognized that Japanese artillery and mortar positions would be less effective in darkness. So he ordered a nighttime attack with no preliminary bombardment. Marines moved silently through the jungle and caught Japanese forces literally sleeping. The attack was a resounding success. Japanese tactical reports after this battle warned, "Enemy forces are no longer predictable in their movements. They have begun to adopt nighttime offensive operations, negating our traditional advantage in darkness." This tactical evolution continued throughout the war. By the time of the Philippines campaign in 1944-45, American forces were using night vision equipment, radar, and sophisticated patrol techniques that actually gave them an advantage in night fighting. Japanese commanders found their traditional edge had evaporated. The radar revolution. Perhaps nothing changed Japanese commanders' tactical assessments more dramatically than the American use of radar. For years, Japanese naval forces had dominated night engagements. Their optical equipment was superior, their crews were extensively trained in night operations, and their tactics were designed around approaching American ships in darkness, launching torpedoes, and escaping before the Americans could respond effectively. Then came radar. Suddenly, American ships could see Japanese vessels in complete darkness, at ranges far beyond visual identification. The Battle of Cape Esperance near Guadalcanal in October 1942 demonstrated this new reality. American radar allowed them to detect Japanese ships and open fire with deadly accuracy before the Japanese even knew they'd been spotted. A Japanese naval officer's report after the battle noted, "The enemy possesses a detection device that operates in darkness and allows accurate targeting beyond visual range. This weapon fundamentally changes the parameters of naval night combat." Japanese commanders struggled to adapt. They tried jamming American radar signals, with limited success. They attempted to close range so quickly that radar wouldn't provide enough warning, but American ships often detected them at 15 or 20 miles distance, giving plenty of time to prepare. They even tried psychological operations, sending fake radio messages to confuse American operators, but radar didn't care about radio deception. By late 1943, Japanese confidence in night engagements, a cornerstone of their naval strategy, had evaporated. They'd lost confidence in their ability to compensate for American material superiority through superior tactics and warrior spirit. Learning the wrong lessons. But here's where Japanese tactical evolution ran into fundamental problems. Even when commanders correctly identified what made the Marines effective, they often couldn't replicate it. Take combined arms coordination. Japanese reports correctly noted how Marines integrated infantry, armor, artillery, and air support. But actually implementing similar coordination required things the Japanese military structure struggled with: flexible communication systems, decentralized command allowing junior officers to make decisions, extensive training time to develop coordination, and most fundamentally, the industrial capacity to produce enough equipment to make combined arms tactics viable. Similarly, Japanese commanders recognized that American logistical superiority, the ability to keep forces supplied with ammunition, food, medical supplies, and replacements, was crucial to Marine effectiveness. But Japan's industrial base couldn't match American production, and Japanese supply lines were increasingly strangled by American submarines. Some Japanese commanders drew the conclusion that they needed to change their defensive strategy entirely. General Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima did exactly this, abandoning banzai charges and beach defenses in favor of prepared defensive positions designed to maximize American casualties. But not all commanders were willing to abandon traditional tactics. At Peleliu in September 1944, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa implemented a defense similar to Kuribayashi's, using caves, prepared positions, and avoiding wasteful charges. The result was a brutal month-long battle that cost the Marines heavily. When American commanders analyzed what made Peleliu so costly, they concluded that the Japanese had learned from previous battles and adapted specifically to counter Marine tactics. Respect through combat. Perhaps the most telling evidence of how Japanese commanders viewed the Marines comes from who they assigned to face them. Throughout the Pacific Campaign, Japanese High Command consistently sent their best units and most capable commanders to face Marine amphibious assaults. The Special Naval Landing Forces, Japan's equivalent of Marines and considered elite troops, were regularly deployed against American Marine landings. Top commanders like Kuribayashi were assigned to defend against Marine attacks. This deployment pattern reveals something crucial. Whatever propaganda Japanese officers told their troops, they themselves recognized that Marines represented the most dangerous threat. You don't assign your best troops and commanders to face an enemy you think is weak or disorganized. A post-war interview with a surviving Japanese colonel captured this thinking. He said, "We knew when the Marines were coming. They were different from regular army units. They specialized in amphibious assault and were trained specifically for the type of warfare we faced on islands. We prepared accordingly." Okinawa, the ultimate test. By the time the Battle of Okinawa began in April 1945, Japanese commanders had fully internalized the lessons of fighting the Marines. Okinawa would be the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific War, and Japanese commanders prepared for it with grim determination. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima commanded Japanese forces on Okinawa. He had studied every American amphibious landing since Guadalcanal. He knew the Marines would come with overwhelming firepower, naval bombardment, air support, artillery, and tanks. He knew they would coordinate these elements with devastating effectiveness. And he knew that traditional Japanese defensive tactics would result in quick defeat. So Ushijima, like Kuribayashi before him, adopted a strategy of defense in depth. He abandoned the beaches entirely, withdrawing most forces to prepared positions in the southern part of the island where rugged terrain and fortified positions would negate American advantages in mobility and firepower. When Marines landed on April 1, 1945, they encountered almost no resistance on the beaches. Some thought the battle would be easy. But as they pushed inland, they ran into the most sophisticated Japanese defensive system yet encountered. Every cave, every ridge, every tomb had been fortified. Artillery was positioned to cover key approach routes. And Ushijima's forces fought a careful, methodical defense designed to maximize American casualties while conserving Japanese strength. The battle lasted 82 days. It cost over 12,000 American lives, including nearly 8,000 Marines. Japanese casualties exceeded 100,000, including thousands of Okinawan civilians. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. But here's what's crucial. Ushijima's tactics worked in the sense that he achieved his goal of delaying the American advance and inflicting massive casualties. His defensive strategy, learned from observing how Marines fought and adapted through years of island warfare, made Okinawa a nightmare for the attackers. The kamikaze perspective. We need to talk about kamikazes, the suicide pilots who deliberately crashed their planes into American ships. Because this tactic reveals something important about how Japanese commanders viewed the war by 1945. The kamikaze campaign was essentially an admission that conventional tactics couldn't stop American forces. Experienced pilots and properly maintained aircraft, flying normal missions, couldn't achieve significant results against American ships bristling with anti-aircraft guns and protected by combat air patrols. But a pilot willing to die could potentially get through. One plane, one bomb, one death, for one American ship sunk or damaged. From a purely tactical standpoint, in a war where Japan had lost most of its experienced pilots and couldn't train replacements fast enough, kamikazes made a brutal kind of sense. Yet listen to how Vice Admiral Mato Megaki, who commanded kamikaze operations, described the missions. In his diary, he wrote about the courage of the pilots, but also the desperation of the situation. He recognized that conventional tactics had failed against American naval power, against the ships that brought the Marines to each island. After the war, when interrogated by American officers, several Japanese commanders admitted that kamikaze tactics were born from tactical desperation. One stated, "We could not match your technology or your numbers. We could only offer what you could not, the willingness of our pilots to die with certainty." But notice what's absent from these statements: contempt for the enemy. There's no suggestion that American forces were weak, or that Japanese spiritual superiority could overcome American material advantages. By 1945, Japanese commanders had fully grasped the reality of what they faced. Personal encounters. Some of the most revealing insights into Japanese commanders' views of Marines come from personal encounters after battles. At Guadalcanal, after Colonel Ichiki's disastrous attack, Marines found his battle flag and personal belongings. Among them was a samurai sword that had been in his family for generations. Rather than keeping it as a trophy, the Marine commander ordered it preserved and eventually returned it to Ichiki's family after the war. When Ichiki's son received it decades later, he said the gesture showed that Americans, even Marine enemies, understood the concept of honor. After Iwo Jima fell, American intelligence officers found letters, diaries, and documents from General Kuribayashi and other Japanese officers. Reading these materials, Marines discovered that their opponents weren't the fanatics propaganda had portrayed. They were professional soldiers, often well-educated, doing their duty even when they knew defeat was inevitable. One Marine who participated in the translation of captured documents later wrote, "Reading their letters humanized them for us. We realized we'd been fighting men who loved their families, who had doubts and fears, who died believing they were defending their homeland." This recognition went both ways. Japanese officers who survived the war and were interrogated by Marines often expressed surprise at the treatment they received. One POW told his interrogators, "We were told you would torture us. Instead, you gave us food and medicine. We were told Marines were barbarians. Instead, we found them to be professional soldiers." Post-war reflections. After the war ended, several surviving Japanese commanders wrote memoirs or gave interviews about their experiences. These post-war reflections provide fascinating insights into how they viewed the Marines they'd fought. General Tadashi Hanaya, who commanded forces in the Philippines, wrote, "The American Marines were the finest amphibious assault force in history. Their coordination of sea, land, and air power was something we could not match. But beyond their material advantages, they showed determination and discipline that rivaled our own." Masanobu Tsuji, a controversial figure who served as a staff officer throughout the Pacific, noted in his memoir, "We underestimated the Americans initially. We believed their democratic spirit would make them weak. Instead, we found that Marines fought with fierce dedication to their comrades and their country. Their patriotism was different from ours, but no less powerful. Perhaps most tellingly, several Japanese veterans formed friendships with American Marines after the war. At reunions decades later, former enemies would meet and share stories. A Japanese veteran who fought on Iwo Jima later visited the United States and met with Marines who had fought against him. He told reporters, "We were both young men doing our duty. I respected them then, even as I tried to kill them. I respect them now as fellow warriors." The myth and the reality. So what did Japanese commanders really think about U.S. Marines? The answer is complex and changed over time. Initially, propaganda and cultural bias led many to underestimate the Marines. They saw Americans as soft, materialistic, and lacking warrior spirit. This contempt cost Japanese forces dearly in early battles. As the war progressed, tactical reality forced a reassessment. Japanese commanders recognized that Marines were highly trained, well-equipped, and fought with a combination of sophisticated tactics and individual courage. Reports increasingly noted Marine effectiveness, adaptability, and the devastating power of combined arms coordination. By the later stages of the war, Japanese commanders had developed a grudging respect for the Marines as formidable opponents. They assigned their best troops to face them, developed specific tactics to counter them, and recognized, even if they couldn't publicly admit it, that Marine superiority went beyond just material advantages. Individual commanders who had experience with American culture, like Kuribayashi, held more nuanced views from the beginning. They recognized American strengths and warned against underestimation, though these warnings were often ignored by more traditional officers. But throughout the war, there was a tension between what commanders knew privately and what they told their troops. Propaganda continued to portray Americans as inferior even as tactical reports acknowledged their effectiveness. This disconnect between propaganda and reality contributed to the tragic costs of battles like Saipan and Okinawa, where Japanese civilians and soldiers chose death over surrender to an enemy who wasn't actually the monster they'd been led to believe in. So we've journeyed through the minds of Japanese commanders, from the overconfident officers of 1942 who dismissed the Marines as weak and disorganized, to the tactical realists of 1945 who developed sophisticated defenses specifically designed to counter Marine capabilities. We've seen how initial contempt gave way to tactical respect. We've explored how commanders like Kuribayashi, who actually understood American culture, tried to warn their colleagues about the formidable opponent they faced. We've examined the brutal propaganda that told Japanese soldiers Marines were cannibalistic demons, even as commanders privately recognized they were facing professional, well-trained warriors. And perhaps most importantly, we've seen how the pressures of war, cultural differences, and propaganda created tragic misunderstandings that cost countless lives on both sides. The story of what Japanese commanders thought about U.S. Marines isn't a simple narrative of heroes and villains. It's a complex tale of professional soldiers on both sides doing their duty, of cultural clashes and tactical evolution, of respect forged through the crucible of combat. These commanders, whether we agree with their cause or not, left us a record of their thoughts, fears, and assessments. Through their letters, reports, and post-war reflections, we can understand not just the history of the Pacific War, but the universal human experience of war itself, the initial confidence, the brutal learning curve, the adaptation under pressure, and ultimately, the recognition that enemies are often more similar to ourselves than propaganda would have us believe. If you found this deep dive into history fascinating, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. I spend dozens of hours researching these topics to bring you stories you won't find in typical history books. Every subscription helps me continue creating this content. Drop a comment below telling me what surprised you most about Japanese commanders' views of the Marines. Were you shocked by Kuribayashi's background? Did the propaganda about cannibalism catch you off guard? I read every comment and your feedback shapes future videos. And if you want to continue this historical journey, check out my video on Suggest Related Topic. It explores another fascinating aspect of the Pacific War that most people don't know about. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Remember, understanding history isn't just about memorizing dates and battles. It's about understanding the human beings who lived through those times and the complex motivations that drove them. Until next time.